Yeah, my name is Kathy Price, and I coordinate Amnesty International's campaigning around priority issues and countries in Latin America, and have been doing work to defend human rights in Colombia for many years. I'm speaking this evening actually because we had our Secretary General, Ketty Nivyabandi, was anxious to welcome Berenice here today to Ottawa and to the Amnesty Office and to introduce her to you and to introduce to you the incredible importance of the work of Berenice and Noma Desk. Unfortunately, Ketty is ill and sent a message to say she was sorry that she can't make it this evening and asked me to say some words for her. And so that's why I'm up here. It is indeed an enormous honor to welcome Berenice here to be amongst us. Berenice is trained as a forensic anthropologist. She has a long and incredibly committed, extremely courageous history of work to protect human rights, justice, and dignity in Colombia. She has worked closely with organized communities of Afro-Colombians and indigenous people who have suffered disproportionate levels of violence and extremely serious violations of their rights during decades of armed conflict in Colombia. Berenice is the founder and the director of Noma Desk, which is the Alliance for Research and Social Action in Southwestern Colombia. Amnesty has worked very closely with Berenice over a number of years, and her organization, of course. And most recently, to document repression during the national strike in Colombia in 2021. And together, our organization and her organization and a number of other organizations in Colombia developed a civil society proposal for comprehensive reform of the police to ensure that the killings of young Black protesters by riot police in Cali never happen again. Berenice, like other defenders in Colombia, has paid a heavy price for her important work. She's been recognized with a Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award. She's been threatened with death on multiple occasions, and Amnesty helped her to leave the country for a period of time to protect her life. But Berenice returned and is deeply involved in exciting, highly important initiatives like the People's Intercultural University and the Roundtable for Human Rights Guarantees and Protection in Buenaventura, and she'll be telling us about that. Let me just finish by saying that Colombia rarely, as Rachel has said, rarely gets the coverage it merits in mainstream media. But you should know that Colombia is at a fragile crossroads right now. A progressive reform government was elected with Gustavo Petro as president, and an Afro-Colombian woman, a human rights defender, Francia Marquez, now vice president for the first time in Colombia's history. And as you will hear, she trained at the People's Intercultural University that Berenice is the coordinator of. This government has committed to bring full and lasting peace to Colombia. Yet peace building on a foundation of rights and justice has many enemies in Colombia who are only too ready to use threats and violence to silence community leaders who challenge their interests and control. Our solidarity is urgently needed to support the efforts of Berenice and those she works with to build peace with justice from the ground up, defending land and water that is essential to our collective survival. These are issues of enormous shared importance. Building stronger movements of solidarity and social action is our shared goal. So once again, we welcome Berenice. We look forward to what she has to say, and we offer our open ears, our open hearts, and our solidarity. Thank you.
As we mentioned earlier, we're going to start with some questions and answers from Berenice. We're going to take very little time in our questions to allow her to take as much time as she can. But I'm going to start with a question because I've also been working with Berenice for a very, very long time and have been a great admirer of her work, but also our union has been a great supporter of Nomadesk, as has CUPE, as has the BC GEU. So I want to also recognize other unions that have been important allies in the work that Nomadesk is carrying out and be able to bring the message to Canadian workers. So I'm going to start, Berenice. I think for Canadians, we're all involved in one way or another in movements or in solidarity. I think it'd be really interesting for people to understand the work that Nomadesk does, the way you form leadership in the different marginal groups of society. But I say marginal in the sense of marginal in terms of not having power, certainly not marginal in terms of what they represent as, of course, ancestral peoples like the Afro-Colombian peoples, the indigenous peoples. You also work with farmers, you work with the youth in the university, you work with youth in the cities. And this has given Nomadesk such a strong and important role because you're articulating, bringing all those organizations together to sit down and to plan, to share. And I think this we could learn a lot. So maybe you could share with people online and hear a little bit of what you do.
Buenas tardes a todos, todas y todes. Para Nómades, para la Universidad Intercultural de los Pueblos, y para mí es un honor estar aquí en este lugar con ustedes. Quiero agradecer principalmente a Amnistía Internacional, a los sindicatos canadienses, a las organizaciones defensoras de los derechos humanos, a CUPE y a las compañeras y compañeros que durante muchas décadas se han solidarizado con Colombia.
Good evening to you all. It's a real pleasure to be with you all this evening and representing both my organization Nomadesk and the Intercultural University of the Peoples. And I would like to begin by thanking all of our allies here in Canada who have been so supportive over many years, PSAC and CUPE, Amnesty International, and other trade union and social movements across Canada who have been our partners and our allies in our work.
Estar aquí, estar aún viva, y que muchos de nuestros compañeros y compañeras defensores de derechos humanos puedan seguir su labor es gracias a la acción internacional y a la solidaridad de organizaciones como Amnistía Internacional, como Brigadas Internacionales de Paz, como CUPE y como los sindicatos canadienses.
The fact that I am here tonight with you, the fact that I am alive, and the fact that I, my organization, and so many of my colleagues in Colombia can continue to do our work defending human rights is thanks to the solidarity and the allyship of so many of you here in the room, so many of the organizations we've worked with, CUPE, PSAC, Peace Brigades International, and others.
Luisita, no podría iniciar a hablar de la UIP sin antes mencionar que todos y todas debemos comprometernos éticamente con el pueblo palestino. Como defensora de derechos humanos de un país que ha vivido el genocidio, no podemos en este momento silenciarnos y por eso creemos que nuestro deber ético es clamar por las vidas de todas las personas que hoy están sufriendo en la Franja de Gaza.
And so I can't begin this evening without, first of all, recognizing that for those of us who do this work defending human rights, we can't not say this evening that we extend our solidarity with the people of Palestine. As someone who comes from a country that has known genocide and that has known massive violations of human rights, I can't not declare here today that we are in full solidarity with the people in the Gaza Strip this evening as we talk about the situation in Colombia.
Somos pueblos hermanos, somos comunidades en resistencia. No importa si somos trabajadores, indígenas, negros, campesinos, obreros o estudiantes. Somos pueblos en resistencia.
We are peoples in resistance, peoples resisting oppression. We are sister peoples. We are farmers and Afro-descendant peoples and indigenous peoples. We are social activists in the cities and in the rural areas, and we are all resisting together.
Por eso, parte del ejercicio de la resistencia, y gracias por la pregunta sobre la Universidad Intercultural de los Pueblos, es haber caminado la palabra por medio de la educación y de la investigación.
And so thank you for your question, Louise, because a very important component of the work that we do at Nomadesk and at the Intercultural University of the Peoples has to do with education and making words become action through education and research.
Este proceso comenzó hace muchos años, hace 528 años.
This process began a long time ago, 528 years ago.
Nosotros seguimos los pasos de nuestros ancestros y de nuestras ancestras.
We're following in the footsteps of our ancestors.
Y por ello, parte del ejercicio que como nómades hemos hecho para defender la vida es llegar a las comunidades para fortalecer su identidad, para fortalecer esos procesos sociales.
And that's why at the heart of our work at Nomadesk to defend life and defend rights, we accompany and advise and walk with people in their communities, with communities in the work they're doing.
Ustedes ven aquí un logo de la Universidad Intercultural de los Pueblos.
You see here the logo of the Intercultural University of the Peoples.
Para llegar a ese logo pasaron 15 años de trabajo en las comunidades más vulnerabilizadas por la violencia política en el país.
To arrive at this logo, we did 15 years of work, working with consulting and hearing the voices of those in the most marginalized and oppressed communities who had been victims of the political violence in Colombia over many years.
Ese logo muestra 4 caminos.
This logo shows 4 pathways.
Y esos 4 caminos hablan de las comunidades negras, de las comunidades indígenas, de las comunidades campesinas y de las comunidades populares, urbanas, obreras y estudiantiles.
And these 4 paths represent Afro-descendant communities, indigenous communities, farmer and peasant organizations and communities, and people in urban organizations in the cities, student movements, women's movements, other movements in the cities.
El pretexto para poder reunirnos con las comunidades fue buscar a través de las universidades públicas y privadas un aula de clase para poder hablar de lo que estaba sucediendo en los territorios más ricos y más importantes geoestratégicamente del suroccidente.
And the idea when we founded this intercultural university was to find a space, a classroom, one could say, to bring together those who have experienced the worst violations in places that have great geostrategic importance because of the resources in these territories and lands. So to find a space for them to come together and talk about and teach about their struggles.
Allí iniciamos a mapear el territorio, a saber cuáles eran las causas estructurales por las cuales se cometían masacres, asesinatos, desapariciones y abuso sexual violento.
And this is how the project, the initiative to map, to carry out a cartography, a mapping of the structural reasons, the structural roots of assassinations, massacres, marginalization, human rights violations began.
Poco a poco fuimos encontrando que una de las causas fundamentales era la gran riqueza en bienes naturales que teníamos en los territorios.
And what we discovered slowly as we started to do this work was that one of the main root causes is the great wealth, the great richness of the resources, in extractive resources below the surface and other resources in the country that are so valuable.
Y ahí nació el primer programa de la Universidad Intercultural de los Pueblos, que se llama Análisis del Modelo de Desarrollo y Derechos de los Pueblos.
And that's where the first program of the Intercultural University for the Peoples was born, which is called Analysis
Del Modelo de Desarrollo
of the Model of Development
y Derechos de los Pueblos.
and Rights of the Peoples.
Comenzamos a trabajar en esta zona del suroccidente, entre los departamentos del Valle del Cauca, Nariño, Huila y Risaralda.
And so we started working in this southwestern corner of the country of Colombia in the departments of Valle del Cauca, Huila, Nariño, and Chocó,
Risaralda.
and Risaralda.
Y encontramos que efectivamente las causas estructurales eran las mismas. Había oro, había níquel, había plata, platino, agua, oxígeno, y eso estaba feriado a los grandes capitales internacionales.
And what we found then as a commonality between all of these regions, these departments in the southwest part of Colombia, what were these same resources, nickel, gold, silver, also abundant water and air, all to be sold off to foreign capital.
Pudimos monitorear que sobre este territorio y particularmente sobre el Pacífico colombiano pasan 17 tratados de libre comercio.
And we were able to discover through our research and our work that these territories are governed and parceled up and meted out to different interests because Colombia has signed 17 different free trade agreements that affect this Pacific region of Colombia directly.
El primero firmado y ratificado fue con Canadá en el 2011.
The first to be signed, the first free trade agreement to be signed was with Canada in 2011.
Y el último con Israel en el 2017.
And the most recent one with Israel in 2017.
Entonces, ahí surge la pregunta, ¿qué podemos hacer? No podemos quedarnos contando muertos solamente.
So from there, the urgent question, what do? We can't just sit around and count our dead.
Y surge el programa Planes de Vida y Humanismo Social.
And that's where the program Plans for Life and Social Humanism was born.
Y ese programa, así como el nombre de este evento, comienza a generarnos esperanza, porque comenzamos a encontrar las diferentes formas de resistencia de las comunidades indígenas, de las comunidades negras, de las comunidades campesinas y de las comunidades urbanas.
And that's where this new hope is born as well. And you hear it echoed in the title of tonight's event, a hope for increased solidarity and this common work that we can all do to resistance to these damaging models that is being done with Afro-Colombian, indigenous, campesino, and urban movements in the country.
Entonces nos damos cuenta de que en Colombia existen dos planes, un plan de vida liderado por las comunidades y un plan de muerte liderado por una historia de racismo estructural, de colonialismo y de un modelo de desarrollo depredador.
And so we see then that in Colombia, there are two plans. There is a plan for life, and it's being led by people at the grassroots, by communities and their organizations, and a plan for death, which comes from a history of conflict, of colonialism, of free trade agreements, of a rapacious and extractive approach to development.
Y un plan de vida que habla del respeto a pensar distinto, a las cosmovisiones diferentes de nuestras comunidades, del respeto a la madre naturaleza, del respeto a los ríos, del respeto a las semillas tradicionales y de posibilidad de potenciar desde los territorios la vida en armonía, en equilibrio y en igualdad.
And this plan for life then is inextricably linked to a cosmovision that sees us in harmony with nature, where we respect the land, the territory, the water, the air, all of our resources, and where we see ourselves as in harmony with this natural system. This is a true plan for life.
Y nacen dos programas más, para hacer un poco más corto el relato, que son el de soberanía y buen vivir y el de comunicación territorial y transformadora.
And so from there were born two other programs at the university. One for
Buen vivir. Soberanía y buen vivir.
sovereignty and buen vivir, good living, an indigenous concept of good living.
Ajá. Y comunicación territorial y
And
transformadora.
territorial and transformational communication.
Estos dos programas permitieron fortalecer ya no solo a las comunidades de cada uno de los territorios, sino a pensarnos más regionalmente. Por ello nace la interculturalidad. No se trata que las comunidades indígenas piensen como las comunidades negras o las comunidades negras como las comunidades indígenas, sino del respeto mutuo de las formas de resistencia y sobrevivencia en medio de la violencia política y del conflicto armado.
And this is where the word and the idea of interculturality comes into play, because it's not an idea that wants indigenous people to think the way Afro-descendant people think and vice versa. No, on the contrary, it's a space where they can collaborate together and share their approaches and their cosmovisions and their understandings as a form of stronger resistance. So it's a more regional, holistic approach than just reinforcing and strengthening individual communities.
Eso es visita lo que se ha posibilitado en este tiempo, fortalecer organizativamente a las comunidades víctimas del genocidio.
So that's what's allowed us to strengthen these communities who have faced genocide. This kind of reinforcement and strengthening has been possible because of these programs.
Thank you. Rachel.
Thank you so much for those words, Berenice. You've already kind of addressed some of the other questions I was going to ask, but if you could please elaborate on them. So obviously we can see how around the world climate change has been taking a serious toll on the environment, especially marginalized, racialized, and indigenous communities. So could you maybe tell us a bit more about how this element of climate justice ties into your work in Colombia, with emphasis on the escalating risk of violent threats against water and land defenders?
Bien, creo que hay varias dimensiones para contestar a tu pregunta. Una es esa dimensión histórica, 212 años de república en Colombia, donde el gobierno se lo ha repartido el Partido Liberal y el Partido Conservador, y asimismo las riquezas.
There are different dimensions to the answer to that question. One of them is a historical dimension that relates to a 212-year history of the Republic of Colombia, where two parties essentially have divided up and plundered the riches and shared between themselves and their elites the riches of the country. Those are the liberal and the conservative parties.
Y en esos 212 años se ha explotado irracionalmente los bienes naturales.
And in that 212-year history of the Republic, these natural resources have been exploited and plundered in an irresponsible and irrational way.
Se ha abierto la puerta de nuestro país a grandes multinacionales mineras, petroleras, que hoy siguen beneficiándose de nuestros bienes naturales.
And we've opened our doors widely to multinational corporations in the extractive and petroleum fossil fuel sectors to come to Colombia and enrich themselves with our natural resources.
En Nómades y en la UIP llevamos varios litigios estratégicos que pueden contar esa historia de cómo se ha arremetido contra las comunidades defensoras de la tierra, principalmente indígenas y comunidades negras, y que han logrado visibilizar que ese extractivismo irracional no le hace bien al país y no le hace bien a las comunidades.
At Nomadesk and at the Intercultural University, at the heart of our work has been an effort to render more visible and raise the profile of ongoing resistance and struggles in Afro-descendant and indigenous communities to make this model of rapacious and irrational extractivism very evident and show how damaging it is to the country and to these communities.
Entonces, por ejemplo, el 22 de febrero del año pasado, fue asesinado un líder agrominero, Teófilo Acuña, defensor de la tierra, un hombre que llevaba más de 30 años luchando contra la gran minería.
And so as a very concrete example, last February, the 22nd of February, a wonderful activist, ¿cómo se llamaba?
Teófilo Acuña.
Teófilo Acuña was assassinated, and he had been directly involved in resistance against extractivist companies in
30 years.
for more than 30 years. Thank you, Luisa.
En el 2018 fue asesinada Cristina Bautista, una gobernadora indígena que luchaba por la defensa de su territorio.
In 2018, an indigenous governor, Cristina Bautista, was assassinated because of her work defending the territory, the land, and the resources there.
Ella fue asesinada con 5 guardias indígenas que su misión era defender la tierra.
She was assassinated with 5 other land defenders, indigenous guards who were guarding and protecting their lands.
Y recuerdo este caso porque tengo que agradecer a los sindicatos canadienses que estaban cuando sucedió el hecho y nos acompañaron hasta el lugar donde sembramos a Cristina, al lado de más de 5,000 indígenas que protestaban no solo por el asesinato de ella, sino por la defensa de la tierra y de la liberación de la misma.
And I'm bringing up this particular case tonight because I'm very conscious of the incredible support we received from Canadian unions who came and buried, we like to say that we planted Cristina in the ground after her assassination. And we did this with 5,000 Indigenous people witnessing all of this. These colleagues from Canadian unions who accompanied us were so important in their support.
El 28 de febrero del año 2018 fue asesinado Temístocles Machado, uno de los líderes negros más importantes del Pacífico colombiano.
On the 28th of February 2018, Temístocles Machado was assassinated. He was one of the most important Black Afro-descendant Colombian activists in the region, in the Pacific region of Colombia.
El 11 de septiembre del año 2020, en medio de la pandemia, fueron asesinados 5 niños en Llano Verde, un barrio cerca a los ingenios azucareros en la ciudad de Cali.
In 2021, the 11th of September, during the pandemic, 5 children were assassinated in a sugarcane area not far from Cali.
Y podría quedarme nombrando muchos otros hechos hasta llegar al genocidio cometido en Cali en el año 2021.
And I could continue to list other cases like this, other horrendous violations and murders like this, leading up to, of course, the now notorious situation that unfolded in Cali in 2021.
Todos ellos eran defensores de la vida y defensores de la tierra.
They were all defenders of life, defenders of the land.
Defender la vida no es solo permanecer vivo,
Defending life is not only staying alive,
es defender la dignidad.
it's also defending dignity.
Y eso fue lo que salieron a hacer los jóvenes colombianos de las primeras líneas, a defender la dignidad del pueblo colombiano, a decir que pare el genocidio.
And that's what Colombian young people did. They went massively down into the streets to demand of the Colombian state that the genocide stop.
64 jóvenes fueron asesinados en la ciudad de Cali, donde está nuestra sede.
64 young people were gunned down, were assassinated in Cali, the city where our headquarters, where our offices are.
Los defensores de derechos humanos estuvimos bajo el fuego durante 4 meses.
We as human rights defenders, we were under fire. We were being shot at and being attacked violently for a 4-month period.
No se respetó nuestra labor.
Our work was not respected.
Las organizaciones internacionales como Brigadas Internacionales de Paz, como las misiones que fueron a Colombia pudieron verificar, hablar con los padres de estos jóvenes, escuchar a los jóvenes torturados, escuchar a los chicos que perdieron, que fueron víctimas de mutilación ocular y saben que lo que estamos diciendo también está en un informe de la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos.
This has all been verified. It's in a report of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and many missions, delegations went to Colombia to verify that all of this took place. Different organizations, trade unions, NGOs, peace brigades was there, and others interviewing the young people, interviewing the parents of those who had been, young people who had been assassinated, interviewing young people who had been tortured, who had lost their eyes and suffered other injuries. So all of this has been very widely documented and verified.
Y cuando uno va a observar el trasfondo de los hechos, encuentra siempre que el problema de la violencia es la tierra. Por eso todos son defensores de la tierra.
And when you analyze, when you look at the background, when you look at the context in which this violence happens, it becomes very clear that it always has to do with defense of land and those who would want to take land and displace people from land to have resources. That's always at the heart of the violence in Colombia.
Thank you, Berenice. And so, as you've just described, environmental justice cannot be isolated from other fights for human rights. But if possible, I know you've already discussed this, could you further elaborate on this intersectional approach that you employ in your solidarity work? So you've discussed racial equity, young people, but maybe could you elaborate on perhaps women defenders, as that is a very big issue in Latin America, as we've heard from Kathy, our campaigner, as well as other defenders who've worked with Amnesty International, and just how those different intergenerational alliances have helped curate more resistances, solidarity, and means of change.
Gracias por esa pregunta, porque parte del ejercicio es justamente esa interseccionalidad, esa integralidad y encontrar en el trabajo pedagógico y en el trabajo organizativo el reconocimiento al camino andado.
Thank you for that question, because this intersectional approach also takes into account the path that we've walked, our history, and so it's important that it be recognized and highlighted here this evening.
Las mujeres del suroccidente son mujeres muy valientes. Son mujeres que se han organizado en guardias campesinas, en guardias de mujeres, que defienden la vida y defienden justamente su territorio.
The women in the southwest of Colombia are very courageous, very strong, and they have mobilized very effectively. They've created units, guardian units, to defend the land, to defend human rights, and they've mobilized these units in quite an effective way.
Por ejemplo, las mujeres de Triana Triana es un lugar en Buenaventura, una zona rural. Se juntaron para hacer una casa de la memoria porque todas ellas son víctimas de las masacres de finales de los 90 y comienzos del 2000.
For example, there's a group of these women in Triana, an area of Buenaventura, who have created a house for memory, to remember, because they've all experienced the violence, the massacres, the genocidal acts in the 90s in particular. And so this is a place of memory and to not have that history erased.
Y ellas han salido a hacer movilizaciones a favor no solo de la vida, sino también de la defensa del territorio, y han denunciado que ese extractivismo que se da en su territorio, que es minería de oro, no debe continuar porque le hace daño a la vida y le hace daño a la naturaleza.
And so they've mobilized in this defense of life, defense of the land, in particular around the issue of gold mining in their territory, which has been very damaging. So standing up, resisting, and saying very clearly that it must stop because it is not in any way benefiting the land or the peoples.
Las mujeres corteras de la caña o esposas de los corteros de caña, que también hacen parte del proceso de la universidad, como las mujeres de Triana, han salido a denunciar el daño que los ingenios azucareros hacen a la tierra, porque son monocultivos que finalmente no solo ocupan grandes extensiones territoriales, sino que destruyen la tierra.
Like the women in Triana, the sugarcane cutting women and wives of men who work in the sugarcane plantations and fields have also mobilized, because like gold mining, not in the same way, but in another way, is very damaging. It is a monoculture. It has a very damaging effect on biodiversity, and so they are also mobilizing these cane workers and their families and these women against the landowners and sugarcane plantation owners.
Las mujeres de Colombia, Huila, han salido a denunciar el fracking como una práctica que no solo beneficia a grandes multinacionales, sino que adicionalmente ha generado violencia política en un territorio donde históricamente no había habido violencia política. Inician los casos cuando se descubre que hay petróleo y que lo quieren sacar a partir de la fracturación de la tierra.
The women in Huila have been denouncing and mobilizing against fracking. Huila is an area that historically did not see a lot of political violence in the armed conflict in Colombia, but when fracking started and when the oil companies moved in, that's when the violence began. So they've also been mobilizing in Huila against fracking.
I think, could I just come in here for a sec? Hi, I think one question, because I'm afraid of time and that we have questions from the audience as well, but one important question that we all have is, given that we have a progressive government that has come to power with Petro and I've got a blank, with the progressive government of the historical pact, what relationship do you have with that government? How do you see the articulation or not of the social movement with the historical pact or the government? We mentioned earlier that Francia had been an important student. I just have to tell the story because we were on a trade union tour. I think it was in 2006 in a van in the area of Suarez where Francia is from. Afro-Colombian community that had been fighting, and mining companies came in, and there were small miners and other fisher people, fish harvesters. And by then, a huge Spanish development took over that area, that lake, and built this huge hydroelectric plant, Fenosa, and left the community pretty well without any electricity. We were in meetings and the electricity kept going out to show this is true. Anyway, Francia was from that community and she was on the road. I think she was 13 years old, and she was weeping on the side of the road. We stopped the van and Berenice got out and sort of said, Francia, what's going on? And she was weeping because she was just a young girl and she just had received her first death threat. This was in 2006 on a road. Like for us, we were in the middle of nowhere, right? We didn't know. And this woman became vice president, first Afro-Colombian woman to ever reach that level of power, first Afro-Colombian to ever be in power at that level. And she's a woman. So I think it's interesting or really important for us to understand how you see the role of the popular movement. This is a workshop about hope, and there's been so much tragedy, so much loss. So how are you seeing the future? And I say along that, we know that the right wing has just, a paramilitary wing of the right wing parties have just won some ground in just the elections that just passed. When were the elections, Sunday or whatever it was? It just happened. And so how do you read that? We know that wherever you make gains, those who lost their power are going to try and get it back through hook or crook, through all the money in the world and everything else. So I'd like to have a sense of hope in that circumstance. How do you see what the next step is, what we need to think about doing as well?
Es una pregunta difícil y es difícil sobre todo por lo que pasó el día de ayer en Colombia.
It's a challenging, difficult question, especially in the context of what happened yesterday in the elections in Colombia.
212 años soportamos de dos partidos políticos que se repartían entre ellos el poder.
212 years, as I mentioned earlier, of two parties splitting up, sharing the spoils of power in the country.
Todo lo que relatamos anteriormente está relacionado con la movilización social, con la fuerza del movimiento en las calles, demandando transformación de la realidad social.
And everything I've said to this point tonight comes from mobilizing, comes from people being in the streets, people organizing in different ways in the popular sectors in Colombian society to bring about change.
Por eso lo que sucedió el año pasado con la llegada a la presidencia de un movimiento distinto al que históricamente había gobernado a Colombia no es una acción de dos personas, es una acción de un pueblo durante mucho tiempo resistiendo.
And that's why it's so important to see what happened last year with the victory and the coming to power of a progressive president and vice president, to not see this as a victory of two people. It's the result, it's the fruit of many, many decades of a much wider social struggle and many movements in Colombia fighting for this change.
En los países de América Latina, a veces solemos volver caudillos a las personas que representan la voluntad del pueblo.
In Latin America, we have a bad habit of making our leaders these heroic caudillos, heroic chiefs, and they are really the protagonists of all the change that happens.
Entonces, si suceden cosas buenas, es responsabilidad de Petro y de Francia, pero si suceden cosas malas también.
So if good things happen, if we make advances, it will be the responsibility of Petro and of Francia. But also if bad things happen, it will be their fault.
Por ello es muy importante trabajar en esa conciencia política para analizar qué fue lo que pasó ayer después de un triunfo como el del año 2022.
And that's why it will be so important to be very attentive to the analysis that needs to take place now of what happened yesterday with this victory of the right in much of the country as a reaction to what happened in 2022 to the election of Petro and Francia.
¿Cuál es la responsabilidad que le compete a un movimiento social que ha sido muy fuerte en los últimos años y que logró en el año 2021 salir a las calles, movilizarse y expresar su descontento con unas reformas como la reforma tributaria que atacaba los derechos fundamentales de la clase trabajadora principalmente?
What is the responsibility and what is the role of social movements in Colombia who have played a very active role in these last few years and have been very strong, especially in what we saw, the movement in 2022, the national strike, and everything that came out of the reform of the taxation system, which was seen as by many as an attack on working people in Colombia.
Entonces hay que comenzar a reconocer que sí hay diferencia en este momento cuando por lo menos en términos públicos se reconoce que tenemos comunidades indígenas y comunidades negras, lo que otros gobiernos negaron históricamente.
So we do have to recognize the progress of this moment. For the first time, a government that recognizes indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples, which no other government has officially done in the history of the country.
Por primera vez en la historia de Colombia, el movimiento social estuvo en la posesión de un presidente. Nunca había sido posible.
For the first time in our history, the social movements played a direct role in the election of a president. The movement that brought the president to power comes out of the social movements.
Y participó de la construcción también de un plan de desarrollo.
And they also participated in the creation of a new development plan for the country.
Sin embargo, eso no es suficiente.
But that's not enough.
El problema estructural de la violencia política en Colombia es muy profunda.
The structural problem of political violence in Colombia is very deep, runs very deep.
Por eso, de pronto, se han generado techos y expectativas muy altas cuando se dice Colombia, potencia mundial de la vida, cuando se dice vamos a vivir sabroso, cuando se dice paz total. Son expectativas muy altas para un país que ha sufrido tanta injusticia social.
And so we are creating very high expectations, very high bars to meet when we say things like Colombia is going to experience a total peace. Colombia is going to be this great country of life and biodiversity. All of these grand statements that are made, the expectations that are generated are very, very high.
Los cambios tienen que ser medibles. La paz tiene que ser medible y monitoreada.
Change needs to be measured and measurable. Peace needs to be measured and measurable and monitored and analyzed.
Si tenemos desplazados, esos desplazados deben retornar a sus territorios.
If we have displaced peoples, those displaced peoples should be able to return to their territories.
Si tenemos extracción de recursos, debe hacerse consulta previa, libre e informada, como lo ordena tanto la Constitución en Colombia como las leyes internacionales.
If there's going to be extraction of natural resources and extractivist activity in the country, there needs to be free, prior, and informed consent. There needs to be true, meaningful consultation of communities, which is demanded by both the Colombian Constitution and international law.
Si tenemos una educación occidentalizada para comunidades étnicas, tenemos que transformar la educación para que a las comunidades les llegue la educación propia.
if we have a Western model of education right now for Indigenous and Afro-descendant communities, we have to allow for the emergence of a truly a Native and Indigenous education system that allows those ancestral communities to be educated in the way they want to be educated.
Si no hay puestos de salud en zonas donde hay conflicto armado, donde hay situaciones de riesgo para las comunidades, hay que volcar la mirada del Estado, del gobierno actual sobre esos territorios y fortalecer las instituciones civiles, porque las comunidades ya no quieren ver más militares ni ataques de ningún grupo contra ellas.
Communities no longer want to be militarized and have a militarized presence. They want the state to be present through infrastructure, through clinics, through schools, a state that has so often ignored these communities and has been absent. They want to see that on the ground, and they want the eyes of their leaders, of their leadership, political leadership, to be turned towards those needs.
Entonces, en estos 14 meses de gobierno del pacto histórico, se han hecho algunos anuncios que si no comienzan a cumplirse, van a ir en detrimento de esa esperanza del pueblo colombiano de una transformación profunda.
And so what we're seeing now after 14 months in power of this new government of the Pacto Histórico, Petro and Francia's government, is that these expectations have been created, and if some of the promises are not delivered soon, there is going to be a real detrimental effect on the hope that has been generated in the country.
Pero la pregunta que yo me hacía esta mañana, viendo los resultados electorales, es ¿por qué nuestro pueblo vuelve y vota por sus verdugos? ¿Por qué? Y la verdad no tengo respuesta.
And the question I was asking myself as I woke up this morning and was confronted with the results of yesterday's election is why? Why do our people, why does my people elect those who will harm them, who will be their oppressors? And I honestly don't have an answer to that question.
Es un momento muy difícil.
It's a very difficult moment.
Es un momento donde la continuidad de esas prácticas sociales genocidas están ahí.
It's a moment where those historical and genocidal practices that we've seen in Colombia are still present. They're still lurking.
Es un momento donde quienes han mantenido el poder, porque es importante decirlo, está el gobierno, pero no está el poder. O sea, el pacto histórico tiene el gobierno, pero no tiene el poder. Y eso es clave que lo entendamos para saber claramente hacia dónde encaminar las luchas.
It's very important that we understand in our analysis that the Pacto Histórico has achieved power, has come to power, but has formed the government, but they don't have the real power in Colombian society. There are other forces that still hold that power, and we need to be very clear about that going forward.
Tenemos que leer entre líneas eso que sucedió ayer y volcar como toda la acción a que esa conciencia política de lo que sucedió trate de defender de aquí a 3 años, que son las nuevas elecciones, lo que se logró en el año pasado. Si no se defiende eso, y si no lo defendemos las comunidades, pueblos y sectores sociales, pues después nos vamos a arrepentir nosotros mismos. No es un problema de Francia y no es un problema de Petro, es el pueblo colombiano el que tiene que decidirse a que el cambio se sostiene, se perfecciona y se mantiene en el tiempo.
So it's not the sole responsibility of Petro and Francia to continue with change and reform. This is on the shoulders of all of the Colombian people, and we need to keep up our efforts to mobilize and organize, in particular in light of the results of yesterday's election. We can't rest on the achievement of the election in 2022. We have to be looking 3 years down the road, and we have to be continuing to raise the political consciousness in the country and to continue to mobilize to defend the gains that have been made, so that we will not be back at square one in 3 years.
Yo tengo fe.
I have faith.
Tengo esperanza.
I have hope.
No ha sido fácil.
It hasn't been easy.
Pero si lo construimos entre todos, lo vamos a lograr.
But if we all build it together, we can achieve this.
No es un tema de solidaridad vista como caridad en Colombia.
It's not an issue of a model of solidarity based on charity. That's not what we're looking for in Colombia.
Es un tema estructural.
These are structural issues.
Es un tema de la humanidad entera.
These are issues for all of humanity.
Colombia es un nombre singular.
Colombia is a unique case, of course.
Palestina es un nombre singular.
Palestine as well.
Ecuador, Bolivia, Argentina, Chile son nombres singulares.
Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina as well.
Pero el pueblo es uno solo. No importa dónde estemos ubicados geográficamente. Si todos tomamos conciencia y salimos de manera unificada, lo podemos lograr. Solos no podemos. Nos toca juntarnos para demandar de quienes tienen el poder de hacer tanto daño en el mundo que frenen su maquinaria de guerra.
But we, the people, we are one, and we can be one if we come together and mobilize and stand up and say no to the machinery of war, no to oppression, no to attacks on human rights defenders, no to all of this injustice. We have to do that together, despite the borders between our countries.
Hay cientos de declaraciones de Naciones Unidas, declaraciones de la CIDH, declaraciones de muchos organismos internacionales pidiendo que frenen las guerras en el mundo. Pero realmente quienes lo logramos somos nosotros. Solo el pueblo cambia al pueblo.
There are endless hundreds of statements from the UN, from the Inter-American Court, from many other institutions demanding ceasefires, demanding an end to violations, to violence, to wars. But at the end of the day, it's only we, the people, who will really stop these realities.
Esa es la realidad.
That's the truth.
Thank you so much, Berenice. I think I'm speaking on behalf of everyone, but we're very entranced by how passionately you're speaking about the situation, especially your frustration with the recent election in Colombia. And now we're going to be moving on to some questions from our audience, but we do want to call up Brent to speak to relations between Canada and Colombia. So if Brent could just come up first.
Thank you so much. Hi, good evening, everyone. Nice to see you. Nice to be here. My name is Brent Patterson. I'm with Peace Brigades International, an organization that has accompanied Berenice for more than 20 years in Colombia. Kathy had asked me just to say a few words about Canada's economic relationship with Colombia, that relationship of plundering that Berenice has been talking about. Maybe just quickly to say, Canada does have a significant economic presence in Colombia. According to Natural Resources Canada, Canadian companies hold $1.4 billion of mining assets in Colombia and $8 billion of energy assets, oil and gas assets in the country. And significantly, just recently, 23 Canadian mining companies operate in Colombia. And of the 69 blocks for new oil and gas exploration that were granted between 2019 and 2021, just before the Petro government, blocks that were granted by the previous government, 39 of those blocks have gone to 4 Canadian companies. So as the Petro government and we all try to address climate change and move away from that economy of oil and gas extractivism, Canadian companies have a massive presence in Colombia in terms of oil and gas and growing. In terms of peace building, Canada, the numbers vary, but somewhere since the peace agreement in 2016, Canada has provided somewhere between $40 to $60 million for peace and stabilization operations programs. That's what the government will emphasize if they're speaking about peace in Colombia. However, significantly, Canada exports millions more really in military goods. I'll put that in some kind of quotes, air quotes for you, military goods to Colombia. That includes armored vehicles that have been sold to the Colombian Army, armored vehicles that have been sold to the Colombian National Police. Significantly, right on the horizon now, the Canadian government, through its various agencies and entities, have pushed for the sale of more light armored vehicles, the same light armored vehicles that Canada sold to Saudi Arabia for internal repression and for the war against Yemen, same armored vehicles to Colombia, and a $500 million contract has just been announced. So about $418 million in armored vehicles will be sold by Canada, manufactured by General Dynamics Land Systems in London, Ontario, to be sold to the Colombian Army. This is troublesome in the sense that we know what has already been done with the military goods that have been sold by Canada to Colombia in the national strike that Berenice was speaking about. One of the armored vehicles manufactured in Toronto by the Incas company blocked a delegation of buses going to Cali, where Berenice is based, to be at a national assembly. And we know that during the sort of a precursor to the national strike, or one of the earlier national strikes, that the Bell helicopters that are manufactured near Montreal were used to surveil the protests by air using facial recognition technology. So these are military goods. These are weapons that are manufactured in Canada. And just recently, the Maple, which is a progressive online news service, obtained documents, briefing notes that had been provided last summer to the then Canadian Defense Minister, Anita Anand, that talked about her talking points for meeting with Colombian officials, made it clear that Canada wants to sell even more weapons to Colombia, and was interested, and I'll put this as an exact quote, in opportunities related to a new naval base in Colombia. Maybe also just to note in terms of the Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement, again, that Berenice had referred to, you'll know that it was signed in August 2011. Lots of things to say about that. The highly problematic human rights assessment, that's a part of that only looks at tariff reductions, the impact of tariff reductions versus the role of investment in human rights violations. So it doesn't look at mining, it doesn't look at oil and gas, it looks at reductions in tariffs. Even there, as Canadian exports has dramatically increased to Colombia under that agreement, and the port of Buenaventura expands to handle that trade, the government doesn't acknowledge, with tariff reductions, the government doesn't recognize the displacement of the Afro-Colombian communities in Buenaventura that comes with the expansion of that port and expanded trade in merchandise. Notably, the Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement includes an investor-state dispute mechanism that allows Canadian companies to sue the government of Colombia if they feel or if they see their future profits, their profits being impacted by interest in the public legislation, public interest. Currently, there's some $1.7 billion, I guess that's US funds, US $1.7 billion in pending claims by Canadian mining companies against Colombia. And as Colombia moves to prohibit fracking within its territory, there's a Canadian company, Calgary-based Parex Resources, that has a license to frack in Colombia, and with the prohibition of fracking would be put in a position or could take advantage of being in the position to sue the government of Colombia for lost future profits because of the prohibition of fracking. I'll just try and quickly wrap up by saying also Export Development Canada continues to play a key role in Colombia in terms of the facilitation of Canadian corporate interests in relation to the plunder, again, that Berenice is speaking about. In the past 10 years or so, Export Development Canada, if you don't know, which is Canada's public bank, has provided some $1.4 billion in financing to oil and gas in Colombia, to companies like Parex, Gran Tierra, Canacol, Ecopetrol. Parex, again, which is a not uncontroversial company, has received 6 loans to up to about $500 million from Export Development Canada. And maybe just in closing, Export Development Canada will say that they now abide by the Glasgow Statement, which is a statement that is around the ending of subsidies to fossil fuel companies as a way to address climate change. There's lots of concern, however, that there's loopholes there for it to continue financing. It refers to international fossil fuel companies rather than sort of domestic fossil fuel companies that operate in Colombia, and it uses this unabated language. So if a company is using the sort of the controversial, unproven carbon capture technology, then it can continue to receive subsidies. So that's also a concern. And again, in that, as Colombia tries to move away from that economy of death, from the economy of extractivism, of oil and gas takings, more than half of the fossil fuel concessions granted by the previous government for coming years have gone to Canadian companies. And so it's something really that we need to be attentive to and acting in solidarity with. I'm sure that's more than 5 minutes, but thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the rest of the evening.
Thank you, Brent, for those very insightful points on how much Canada commits these crimes in the name of resource extractive industries, although they're continuously preaching sustainability and climate justice. So that answers one question we received from someone online. But for the next question for Berenice, someone was asking about the role of media in Colombia. So we see how governments, law enforcement, and extractive corporations directly influence media bias and distort the narrative, even here in Canada to Palestine currently. And so we just wanted to know, how is it in Colombia?
Los medios de comunicación en Colombia, sobre todo, digamos, los que pertenecen a los 5 grupos económicos más fuertes del país, evidentemente han ocultado de manera histórica los hechos que se suceden en contra de las comunidades y solo muestran lo que les beneficia a ellos como grupos económicos.
The media in Colombia, which is highly concentrated and controlled, the mainstream media, by 5 large groups, economic groups in the country, have historically always hidden a lot of the facts on the ground and benefited their side of the story in terms of telling the story of development in Colombia. And they've hidden a lot of the violence that's taking place in communities.
Su participación, por ejemplo, en hechos que fueron determinantes contra el movimiento social, tanto en el paro del 2019 como en el paro del 2021, es claro, es decir, los medios son responsables del ataque a los jóvenes y del ataque a los manifestantes, tanto en el paro del 2019 como en el paro del 2021, para no ir más lejos, ¿no?
And we don't even have to go very far back to see the direct involvement and direct responsibility of the media in terms of attacks on protesters, demonstrators, those resisting young people, both in the 2019 strike and in the 2021 national strike.
Durante las 2 protestas, en tiempo real se transmitió por parte de los participantes de las manifestaciones los hechos violentos de la fuerza pública. Ni RCN, ni Caracol, ni Semana nunca publicó nada de esos hechos que muchos de ustedes conocieron por vía WhatsApp, porque existe esa otra opción.
And so we saw during these protests that there was live streaming, there was broadcasting in real time of what was going on, but none of the major networks or media interests in Colombia, Caracol, RCN, and others, none of them used this content, none of them showed it. It was completely hidden and not on their airwaves. But many of you saw it because it was shared over WhatsApp and other apps.
No se les pedía otra cosa que contaran la verdad, pero no fueron capaces de contar la verdad, la ocultaron. Y esa es otra forma de ser responsable de los crímenes. Pero además señalaron a los jóvenes de ser vándalos, una figura que aparece en estas 2 últimas grandes movilizaciones en Colombia y que lo que intenta es señalar a los jóvenes como si fueran enemigos internos.
Mm-hmm. And not only did they not do what we ask of our media to do, which is to tell the truth, they hid and obscured the truth, but they also were very much involved in telling a counter and untrue narrative and of showing the young people involved in these demonstrations as being vandals, as being, those who wanted to destroy property and create disorder in the country. So there was a disingenuous, and a very obvious attempt to to target them. Yeah.
Los medios de Colombia, los grandes medios también son responsables de los resultados de ayer, de las elecciones.
And so they are also responsible for the results in the election yesterday.
Y son responsables de de haber perdido la consulta de paz en el plebiscito, porque señalaban que quien votaba por la paz votaba por una sociedad que se iba a volver, todos nos íbamos a volver lesbianas, todos nos íbamos a volver gays, es decir, rompía ese principio de la sociedad colombiana de la lucha por la diversidad y señalaba en las iglesias cristianas y en las iglesias católicas como si votar por la paz fuera entregarle el alma al diablo.
And the media in Colombia was also very directly responsible for the result in the plebiscite around the peace accords, and was quite homophobic in its approach, saying, that if the plebiscite, is approved in the affirmative, that everyone's going to become a lesbian or homosexual, and they were very involved with evangelical right-wing churches in the country to demonize, what the mainstream of Colombian society has always celebrated, which is its diversity, and seeing its diversity as a strength.
En conclusión, los medios en Colombia son responsables de la violencia política.
And so to conclude, I would say that the media in Colombia is very much directly responsible for the political violence in the country.
Thank you, Berenice. And so I think that brings us to our final question, which is, people are just wondering if there's a website for the People's Intercultural University. How can they learn more? Any specific resources or any activists or young people that they can follow who are working for resistance and solidarity on the ground?
Sí, eso es como uno de los elementos de esa área transversal que es la comunicación territorial y transformadora. Tenemos como un registro y una memoria histórica audiovisual muy importante en la página web. Entonces es www.nomadex.com. Allí están tanto las acciones de defensa de la vida como las propuestas pedagógicas e investigativas. Desafortunadamente están todas en español, pero siempre hemos pensado la importancia de tener algunas cositas en inglés y es posible que próximamente tengamos esa posibilidad.
Yes, so there are many resources available to you. Our website, www.nomadesk.com, has a whole archive of all of our actions. It really is sort of a repository of our collective memory as an organization and as a movement. This has to do with our pedagogical approach, with our approach of communication as transformation. And so you can find a lot of information there. It's almost all in Spanish. There are a few documents in English, but and we're hoping to have more in the future, but it's mostly in Spanish.
Y también quiero, a propósito de lo que preguntas de la solidaridad, ustedes no saben lo importante que es cuando pasa algo, ver que ustedes replican una acción urgente, que la traducen en otros idiomas, que hay otras personas que la conocen. Eso es sumamente importante. También las visitas de la comunidad canadiense, de los trabajadores canadienses, la importancia, yo lo decía ahorita, de que los sindicatos de servicios públicos y otros sindicatos nos hayan acompañado en terreno, eso nos da fuerza. Pero además es una misión de observación que luego difunde lo que está pasando.
And so I would be remiss if I didn't also say how important all of your gestures and actions of solidarity with us when a particular event happens or an attack, having people share and like and retweet and spread in their networks that information is extremely valuable, very important. The translation of documents and reports and what's going on the ground, sharing within your networks. A lot of the public service and public employee unions in Canada have been very involved in this work for many years, and that solidarity is really vital to us.
Es también muy importante recordarle al gobierno actual de Colombia, del pacto histórico, que debe trabajar para cumplir los acuerdos con los que se defienden las comunidades en los territorios. Por ejemplo, la protección colectiva del territorio. Entonces, esos acuerdos son fundamentales y a veces cuando se lo recuerda a la comunidad internacional hay más interés que cuando los mismos colombianos exigimos que se cumplan.
It's also very important that you all play a role in reminding the current government of the Pacto Histórico, of the importance of it, respecting and continue to implement the various agreements it has signed, including agreements on collective right to the land and others. Sometimes the voices of the international community can be very helpful in prodding. Colombians are going to continue to remind their government of what it needs to do, but we need to have international voices as well who prod and pressure.
Pero sobre todo es fundamental que cada uno de ustedes, quienes están conectados por Zoom, quienes están aquí presentes, demanden al gobierno canadiense que ni un peso más para la guerra en ninguna parte del mundo, ni un peso más para la guerra en Colombia. No queremos tanquetas, no queremos Benetton, no queremos gases lacrimógenos, queremos educación, queremos salud y queremos fortalecer los procesos organizativos de las comunidades naturales en nuestros territorios.
And lastly, I would just urge you all to continue to ask your own government, the Canadian government, to not spend one more dollar on arms, on supporting violence and wars in any country. But tonight, as we're talking about Colombia, in Colombia, we don't want your armored vehicles. We don't want your tear gas. We don't want your weapons and your arms. We want schools and clinics and respect for rights and communities that are vibrant. And that's the message we want you to tell your own government.
Ahora que llegábamos con Katy a Amnistía y veía el monumento a la vida de Berta Cáceres, pero a la vida de muchos luchadores y luchadoras por la tierra, sentía, porque conocí a Berta, que ella desde donde esté, como Teófilo, como Cristina, nos están demandando memoria histórica, no olvido, y que estos monumentos sean la constancia histórica de que estos hechos no se pueden volver a repetir.
When I arrived a few hours ago with Kathy, we were out in the yard here and looking at the monument to Berta Cáceres and her struggle. And I was reminded of the fact that Berta and Teófilo and Cristina and so many others are looking down at us and asking us to continue this work, and that we can never forget what has happened, and we have to continue to struggle that these crimes not be repeated in the future.
Nosotros sembramos vida, sigamos sembrando vida.
We plant and sow life, let's continue to do so.